Welcome back to In the Reads, the official podcast of The Read Magazine, the oldest literary journal west of the Mississippi. I'm Ryan Steele. On today's episode, I got a chance to speak with Colin Winnette, who served as the judge for the John Steinbeck Award in Fiction this past fall. During our conversation, we discussed Mr. Winnette's new novel, Users, as well as several other topics concerning technology and the future of storytelling. Let's take a look. Kind of during your process being the judge for the John Steinbeck Award and then also doing the consultations for CLA, have you been seeing any trends in the types of stories people have been submitting in 2023 versus other years you've read submissions?
Great question. It's hard to parse a little bit the timeline of it, because I feel like every judge, every institution that I've judged for, or like every magazine that I've worked as like a reader for or an editor for, they tend to have something of either an intentional or kind of like unintentional aesthetic center. So, you see kind of trends in groups. Like when I was reading, I used to edit for Pank magazine with Roxane Gay, and a Pank submission was pretty identifiable, and pretty different. And especially, every now and then you get someone who's just like spraying their work everywhere, and you're like, okay, this is probably not. Sometimes those got accepted, but more often than not, it was the ones that's like, oh, you read this journal and you're familiar with it, and you have some aesthetic overlap that like kind of makes you make sense. But you get delightful surprises too. So that's a long way of buying myself time to think about this question more. I have found, so in the last couple, I've done a couple university and college contests this semester. And I've noticed that a lot of finalists, there's a much larger range in terms of like world building that I'm seeing, which includes both fantasy and sci-fi, more genre work, but also just in terms of, I think 5 to 10 years ago, I would get a lot of like melancholy guy and bar stories, and delightfully seeing fewer of those and a lot more interest in filling in all the kind of details around the individual the story might be about. And that, that just takes a lot of different, it looks a lot of different ways. But I think that's been an underlying thing. It's like those are people who are more interested in the sort of systems around the character that they're writing about versus the kind of character's like solipsistic experience, which is a really cool shift in the lens. And it can be also hard to say that whether or not that's actually the case or just something that I'm responding to more, because I definitely wrote my fair share of melancholy dudes in rooms trying to have conversations. And so like as my own interest has like looked to making my projects bigger, like maybe I've just been responding to that more, but I feel like I've noticed that more. And I think that also, I noticed in student work too, which is really heartening, because I feel like when I was a student, there was a kind of a set of aesthetic principles that were kind of handed down from minimalists and Russian novelists that, or Russian short story writers, I should say, that kind of yielded a certain product. So yeah, I think that interest in the larger world and in the systems novel and in world building, if I had to pick a trend, I'd say that's one that I'm noticing the most.
Gotcha. Well, do you ever read a submission, I guess when you were working at the magazine, where it felt like the author was kind of trying to hit check marks? They've kind of thought what the magazine is, or what the book or catalog that they're submitting to is, and kind of what their tone is. So I guess there is kind of that like trying to play to like what the reader is looking for without trying to be too much of just check mark and lose sort of your touch as an author.
Yeah. Definitely. I hear what you're asking. I hear what you're saying. I don't think I've had that exact experience, to be honest. Like you can definitely, I'm sure there are pieces that I've read where that was part of the thinking. like I need to sort of do a certain thing in order for this to stand out with these readers. If it's not working, then the story just kind of feels like a mess. And if it is working, then it feels like a success. So it's like I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, they're just doing the obvious thing. If the story is working, and then you're like, okay, well, like what a feat, you read certain things and you're like, I'm impressed when someone can be like, I want to write a best-selling novel, or like you hear about John and Paul of the Beatles being like, let's write a pool, let's like write a song that's so good that we're going to get a pool. And some people would be like, oh, that's like shallow and not what art should do. And certainly it shouldn't be the sole aim from my perspective, but like it is still extremely impressive to me to be able to set that goal and accomplish it, because Lord knows I can't do it,
Well, no, I mean, actually, I think about that too, because there's a podcast I listen to called Your Favorite Band Sucks. And it's supposed to be kind of like a deconstruction of like the rock star identity. The whole kind of premise is they find sort of angles to criticize universally beloved acts, but on April Fool's Day, they'll take a band that is universally loathed or criticized and make a case why they're awesome. And their episode on Nickelback, like an April Fool's episode on Nickelback, they're talking about like, hey, these guys found the perfect formula. Like they studied a formula like mathematically to get radio play, and it worked. And that's admirable. And that kind of made me go, okay, so how much trash can you really talk for, someone being kind of self-aware of commerciality?
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting being, I don't know, I guess I'm not really a Gen Xer, but I was certainly like raised by Gen X sensibilities. Those are the movies I watched and the music I listened to. And so you have a certain like association with the idea of like selling out equals bad. Whereas I feel like now the thinking around that has completely reversed, and it's like selling out equals you're a genius, it's like like people talk about the quality of films based on the amount of money they made, versus like the text, which is it's an interesting thing to sort of ride that cusp as I have in my life of being like, at one point this was the clear objective was to like to not sell out and to be artistically pure, or whatever that, the unattainable thing that was used to like sort of shape our thinking at the time, largely perpetuated by like MTV and corporate rock, but whatever. Like just to have it completely flip and be like, no, now we're in the gig economy. Now we're in the CEO economy, where it's like, the thing is like the better you are at anticipating the audience's needs and giving them exactly what they need, the like more savvy and accomplished you are. We're kind of talking about like business versus art, but like it is interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, even in the rise in like popularity of fan fiction, which I think is like a really impressive and cool thing, like that, I feel like there was a period where it was like, oh no, you're just attaching yourself to some like fantasy fulfillment, like larger thing. And but now it's like there's a real celebration of the, I don't know, authorial integrity that goes into those imaginings. So it's cool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I was curious, with your book Users, I was kind of, when I started reading it, I was interested because like a big thing that a lot of journals and reviews were saying is kind of like, this is sort of the first great book about virtual reality. And I've kind of noticed in the literary landscape, there's sort of a lot of books now about big tech. And it's almost maybe a thing where it's become such an integral part of our lives, you're almost bending over backwards to not mention it. But something I found interesting about your book is that it was kind of more focused on the character Miles and sort of family dynamic, family trouble, melodrama. Of course, I need melodrama as a genre. So I was curious kind of if like when you were writing the book, you made an active choice and like to write a book about virtual reality, but kind of focus more on the human family aspect.
No, I mean, I started with the family for sure. It was started with the characters and the family dynamic, and then just in terms of sort of like tying it back into the larger world building, I did start with like the husband and the wife and the daughters like in the kitchen, kind of like failing, to communicate comfortably with one another. And that was what sort of drew me in, was that fucked up family dynamic. And then just in thinking about like, okay, so like, where does this book go? What happens next? I'm in a writing group with a few other writers, and I had shown them a completely different piece. It was totally unrelated. And in that piece, someone was asking what the character did to make money. And, at the time I was just like, oh, that hadn't even occurred to me, like, it doesn't seem relevant to this like particular interaction that's being described, but of course it is. And so for users in those early nascent stages, I was just like, how do I incorporate this question and think about it more and challenge myself to answer it and to make that answer meaningful. And so it was kind of like, yeah, you can almost like detect it in the way the book develops, where it's like this first chapter is so interior and so like a person sort of like grappling with a anxiety and a fear, the death threats, while kind of like trying to navigate this like almost claustrophobic family dynamic. And then it's like, and then he went to work and work was like a whole other set of problems. And that's where all the kind of tech stuff came in. And I hadn't initially set out to write about, as I just said, I didn't initially set out to write about work at all. And sent him to work and all of this kind of stuff about my own relationship to tech industry and tech work, tech jobs that I've done in my time here in San Francisco, just started kind of pouring out, and like all these like thoughts and feelings and observations and characters. And so that it was like the whole novel suddenly unlocked itself. And to speak to your point from before, I think that might be part of why we're seeing a trend in it. I mean, obviously there's an interest in it, but also people are just, it's sort of this undeniable force in a lot of people's lives, whether we like embrace it or not, and so I think, in a big way, Users is a novel about communication. And so it was important to me to like try and make that like the tech that they're using to make it have a social angle to it, because I wanted to talk about the ways in which our manipulations of communication and in the field of communication affect our relationships and affect our sense of ourselves and our sense of one another. And yeah, so I think that like part of our identity now in this contemporary world is forged through our relationships with tech. And that's part of why we see it a lot in art too, because it's like, who are we without these things now? There's a lot to us, but we don't have access to it,
You said something that reminded me of this. I know that Instagram posts aren't the best source as far as noting cultural trends, but this summer when the Barbenheimer event was kind of happening and people were responding to Oppenheimer, I saw a post saying like, you ever notice that all these auteur filmmakers only make period pieces, or at the very least things that take place prior to like the year 2000 or so? And a lot of the comments were saying, oh, it's because, people don't want to bring in social media or big tech. But reading your book, I thought you did a good job of kind of it being nuanced and being relevant to what's kind of happening in the world without being, I guess, for lack of a better term, memey. Mm-hmm. Or, I don't know if that's something that you ever kind of like think about, whether it's like you're in the process of writing, or if you're watching or reading something and you maybe think like, that seems kind of Reddit centric.
Yeah, I think about this a lot in terms of just like the influence that social media has on our language and our thinking, especially because I work in an art form that is built from language. And so, it's like I've always thought a lot about influence and inherited thought and those kinds of things and how they worm their way into your work. And that's why, I initially was really interested in constraint-based work. And then I was really interested in genre, because I was trying to find ways of generating work that sort of foregrounded the influence, the sort of like inherent, like the sort of like the structures that inform the storytelling, so that they wouldn't be as hidden from me even, where it's like, if I'm going to talk about something, it comes with all of this like sort of narrative structural lineage that I'm like processing subconsciously on some level. And so I just started trying to foreground all of those decisions in a way that was generative for me, but also felt kind of honest. So, but yeah, along those lines, at the same time, I was avoiding writing about tech for as long as I possibly could. And I think part of that is, I think it all happens really fast. And so our relationship to it doesn't always get time to gestate. And like, you need time with something, be it a divorce or a loss or a love or an iPhone. You need time to like process it and experience it and then reapproach it and figure out some way to make it artful when you're talking about it in your work. And so if you're just dumping the thing onto the page the moment, it's entered your life, it's not always going to have that sort of careful artistic packaging or thought going into its presentation. That's not to say you can't. Certainly people can just write from a place of pure reaction and write brilliant things, but I do think I try to be a little careful and thoughtful about like where this stuff is coming from. And you can never fully know. And that's a big theme in users, is this question of like, where does an idea come from and who is responsible for thought? And it's clearly something that I'm like totally confused about and worried about as we further and further like access our most like sort of responsive and reactive selves. That's an answer. But yeah, I mean, like tech, but I appreciate what you're saying, because it's definitely an anxiety of mine, like how to write about the contemporary world, how to not just avoid it, but how to do it in a way that allows me to like have something to say about it versus just kind of reporting on it. But yeah, I'm trying to think more about this tech. I think also partially with the auteur thing, there seems to be, I don't know, I can't claim to have the mind of Christopher Nolan or Ridley Scott or any of these, or Greta Gerwig. But there seems to be a kind of a desire to make something monolithic. And I think that's part of why you get period pieces and part of why you get the construction of a world that they have more total aesthetic control over. Even the idea of Barbie Land, where it's like, I want to set this story kind of with that as the center, because it gives, then all of the decisions have a sort of like narrative structural excuse for being sort of consistent with my particular vision. I think we have moved away from the Wire kind of approach of like, this is just like this is what reality is, man. Which I love the Wire, but it is interesting to see even our quote unquote realistic films. Oppenheimer, I guess, can be called that, even though it's it is weirdly his most like disorienting and experimental film, more so than like his One About Dreams. But they're ultimately, by setting them in another time and place, it gives them the same quality that like a superhero movie has of being kind of fantasy, where it's like, none of us are subject to this reality that I'm presenting to you. And so I can make it kind of what I need it to be and inspire awe in you and tell this story without the intrusion of the audience being like, well, that's not how I feel about reality. You could say like, it's not how I feel about Oppenheimer, but like, it's a different, well, in this world, we're only getting this sliver of them. It was interesting to read the book next to that movie and see the changes they made. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's starting to feel more like a Christopher Nolan movie now that I have a better sense of what decisions were being made versus, what's historically accurate.
With Oppenheimer, it's funny because I remember on the drive to go see the movie, a friend of mine, because he had read the book and everything, and he was talking about like, oh, at one point in time, he tried poisoning a professor because he disagreed with him. I'm like, oh, wow, I wonder if that's going to get brought up in the movie. And then it's kind of like, it's like a quirky, like, young Oppenheimer, you silly goose. Like, he
such
almost
ambition, yeah.
Well, I guess what you're saying makes sense, because with when doing something from the past, I guess there's sort of like, if you look at it from a new historicist lens, it's everyone now has some sort of perception of what ultimately became of World War II. It does become a thing where the author has more control over it versus if you have some sort of bold thesis statement about something more contemporary, there's maybe a bigger fear that people are going to say, hey, that's not even how it works, pal.
I mean, I think that's also part of why we see a return to historical stories too, is we feel more, in the last 8 years, I think a lot of people, I don't want to say everyone, I think a lot of people feel the weight of history on their shoulders, and the sort of the sense of being in history, and the sense of being like, wow, it's hard to imagine what the future will look like. Wow, it's hard to think that this isn't this like sort of point of no return in our sort of like cultural narrative or historical narrative. And so there is a way of exploring that feeling without depressing the shit out of everybody by jumping back to these other kind of iconic turning points in history.
So you said you worked in tech for a little bit when you were in San Francisco?
Yeah, I still do. Well, and I write for a mobile phone game. So, it's been good. I mean, it's if you read users, you could tell that I have somewhat complicated feelings about it. But it is different, and it's like anything else, in the sense of there were certain places I worked that were extremely criticism worthy, and there were other places that were really honestly trying their best, and there were other places that were somewhere in between. And the kind of the strangest part for me was kind of getting like absorbed by it, and it is like sort of a financial pressure, certainly in the city. My first few years here, I was a bookseller, and I love doing it, and I kind of wish I still did it. But it is a very different, I'm 40 years old, and we have an apartment in one of the most expensive cities in the country. And so I was creating a kind of like at home situation where, through doing the stuff that I love, being a writer and selling books, I was kind of putting all the pressure on my wife to like fill in the other, financial weight of it, the rest of the financial burden. So I wanted to contribute more evenly, and also we both had student loans to pay off, so we were like, we got to make more money. So I kind of started writing for websites, and then got pulled into some app stuff that was like similar to the writing I was doing for websites. And then just the kind of like, I'm sure a lot of writers who might listen to this have some familiarity with that kind of just like contract work hustle. I did that for a really long time, and then got one contract that was writing for a game probably like 6 years ago. And I was like, wow, this is so much better than writing about teeth implants. Like I just, I want to write something that even remotely resembles fiction and uses what I think are my stronger muscles. So I kind of threw my chips in with that to see how it went. And that has turned into the relative steady work. It's my day job now. And it's been good. I mean, you see a lot of like capitalism is on much more sort of naked display in these companies that are scrambling to like, to grow in dying markets. It was eye-opening for me in a lot of ways. It was a sense when I was a bookseller where I was like, I don't have to really like think about too much stuff. I can live in this kind of like, not to say that other booksellers don't think about it. They definitely do. But I was like, coming out of grad school, I was just like, I can just like sell books and be like, literature is all that matters. And I may still feel that way, but I realized that there are other very powerful forces at work in the world too. So yeah, it was kind of like an eye-opening experience for me to move into those industries. Yeah.
Do you kind of think that technology has made people kind of look inward, maybe be more self-aware than maybe before? And so do you think that could be a good or bad thing, or it could be neutral?
Man, I don't know. That's a tough question, because I don't want to speak for everybody. I don't know what everybody else's experience is. My experience of technology is that it does not elicit introspection. It doesn't really reward it. Other people, that may be untrue. I had a friend who's a writer, and we were during lockdown, we were playing video games together on PlayStation and kind of just talking late to the night. And he was kind of starting to go to school for writing, and I had just published a book. And so he was kind of like, and he's a more of a bigger gamer than I am. And he was just like, my partner was telling me that I can't like play video games and be a writer. Do you think that's true? And I was like, well, I mean, here I am playing a video game with you, and I have a book coming out, so I think maybe demonstrably untrue. But I was like, she might be trying to say something else. She might be trying to tell you that like you're doing this more than the other thing. And I do, but I'm telling this whole story just to say that I think my answer was something along the lines of, you have to just be honest with yourself about like what you're actually doing. Like you can of course do anything else and be a writer. There's nothing that like can stop you really, I think. I mean, probably, yeah, like if you're actively on fire, it would be hard to write or something, but I mean, people write in all kinds of life situations, or write from them eventually. But I was like, but if there's something but if you're spending all of your day kind of avoiding writing by jumping into technology, by jumping into video games, by jumping onto social media, and then spending your free moments away from it, obsessing over like, I haven't been doing it, or like, I should like, blah, blah, blah. And then work is just not getting done. Then I think then you can start to say like, honestly, self-accounting, self-responsibility, like this might be interfering with me to some degree. My policy has always been like, if I'm concerned that something might be slowing me down, like try cutting it out and see what happens. And then, it doesn't always, doesn't mean like I have to like say like, I'll never play a video game again. But it's like, if I'm kind of staying up till 1 every night playing a video game and I'm not getting any writing done, and I'm just like, I wish the writing would come. It's like, be like, all right, I'm going to cut the game out until I stop feeling this way. And then when I start feeling like confident in my practice again, then I will, start to give myself these things that are like enjoyable, but are ultimately, for me, my experience of them, they fast forward time. I feel like I guess that's a really long answer to your question, but I do think that a lot of relationships to tech fast forward time, and we're just like, wait, now it's 3 hours later, or it's a year later, and what have I done? At least for me, yeah. So I get pretty concerned about that, because it's also like I don't feel any different on the other end of that. If I write for an hour, I feel fundamentally different on like a cellular level. But if I play a video game for 3 hours, I come out of it feeling the exact same way I did when I went into it, maybe slightly more frustrated, but and again, like I'm not at all trying to generalize about it. I know a lot of writers who play the hell out of video games and are extremely productive and creative and thoughtful and all of that. There's no formula for unlocking your sort of artistic self, but yeah, it's just about being honest with yourself about whether or not you're actually doing that, or whether or not I hide in tech a lot of times, when I'm like anxious about what to do, just open up Instagram and suddenly 45 minutes has passed, it's just like, where did it go? What do I have to show for this?
So did you have a game you were playing a lot while you were writing users?
Damn. Trying to remember now. I honestly think I was playing Dark Souls 3 a lot, because I wrote it kind of during lockdown, started a little bit before, and definitely worked on it a lot during that. And yeah, I was playing the hell out of Dark Souls 3. I think I played it 3 times, because it was a really good lockdown game. Have you played it?
I haven't, no. So my problem with gaming is Resident Evil 4 is my favorite game of all time.
Oh, wow.
And okay. It's hard for me to find a game I like as much. It's just the game mechanics are just so perfect, in my opinion. I mean, it's one of those things I couldn't play when I was a kid, but I remember it was always being hailed as like the greatest game of all time. But my parents didn't let me play it because I was too young. So finally, when I was out on my own, I downloaded it on Steam, and it really, like, my friends who know more about like game design than I do say it's like the structure is very like obvious or whatever, and that like everything is right in front of you need to do.
Right.
But I don't know. To me, it's just like the amount of strategy versus chances to shoot stuff. Like that balance to me is just like perfect.
Cool. I have not played Resident Evil 4. I think I played the first Resident Evil when I was a kid, but Yeah, but yeah, they're satisfying games. I mean, Dark Souls is, famously extremely frustrating and I think it's more linear than some of the other ones, but pretty non-linear. It's pretty hard to know what to do, which, is, for me, was a really rewarding experience, especially during like sort of the emotional and psychological landscape of lockdown, just because I was, feeling lost and feeling very mortal and helpless, and you are all of those things in the game, but it rewards kind of just like, you have to, for me at least, being a very bad video game player, that the only way forward in that game was to be kind of like the tide, just like constantly hurling myself against these obstacles and then eventually somehow squeaking through, but it's 98% loss and failure. Like, and it really just like perfectly suited my sort of outlook at the time.
So I didn't want to take up too much of your time, so I guess I just wanted to close with, do you have any big plans for writing or anything really in going into 2024?
Yeah, that's it. I do. I'm getting into a superstitious place around talking about stuff that's in progress. So
Sure.
I used to feel like I need to be able to do it, and now I'm just like, it's so fragile. I just feel like I've lost so many projects to describing them. So I am working on a couple longer things, and I think every new book that I try to write, I try to do that thing like with like I did with users, of being like, there's this question that someone asked me that I don't have an answer for, so I need to, how do I like address this hole in my work? And like, maybe it's something that is intentionally a hole, and that's fine, or maybe it's something that like I was avoiding, and so I just try with each new project to be like, what, not just like what have I not done, but like what have I like been able to avoid thinking about or trying, or all that stuff. So there's a lot of stuff I'm doing right now is bad because it is like the result of me trying to stretch a little bit and grow a little bit. And so there's a lot. So I have like kind of 3 fiction projects that are all hopefully going to amount to something, but may also just be terrible exercises of an attempt. I mean, yeah, I feel like I have a sort of pattern of writing one long book length manuscript between every published book that gets thrown away. That's just kind of like, here's a random bad impulse that I needed to kind of like cough out before I could, sing my song or whatever. But I am excited to write. I'm working with Bloomsbury. They have a new series of film book. It's kind of like it's called Time Codes, the series. It's sort of like 33 and a third, the way they have like a writer write a book about an album. They're having writers write a book about a movie. And so I'm committed to trying to do one for them. So it'll be my first nonfiction book. I'm very excited to like dig into this film and try and write about it and try and do something really different from what I've normally done. And yeah. So that's kind of like on the horizon now. And then novels, hopefully some new ones, hopefully something exciting and fresh that has never been done before by me.
Well, thanks for taking the time. For those of you listening, Users by Colin Winnette is out now. Colin, thank you very much for doing this interview.
Of course, yeah, thanks for talking with me.
In the Reads is the official podcast of Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. Find us online at www.readmag.org. Thank you for listening.